So I'm going to go through that live on video to give you my initial thoughts on FAR Part 19. The big headline is that the rule of two survives. There was a lot of speculation on whether the FAR might delete the rule of two because it is not statutory above the simplified acquisition threshold. And fortunately for the 60,000 small business prime contractors out there, the rule of two is retained in this revised FAR overhaul of Part 19. It's retained in an interesting way. There used to be two separate rule of twos. There was one between the micro purchase threshold and the simplified acquisition threshold. Many people refer to that as the statutory rule of two. I think I wrote something about that last week about how there's a statutory rule of two. And then there's a regulatory rule of two above the simplified acquisition threshold. The text of those is somewhat similar, a little bit different. The FAR felt it possible to combine those into one rule. So now, under the revised FAR, there's one rule of two, one rule. There's one set aside requirement. The rule of two is the rule that you must set aside acquisitions at this particular dollar threshold if there are two or more small businesses that would provide the products at a competitive price. And in the new FAR, in the new overhaul, this is part 19.104, the FAR is combined. They've smushed together those separate rules into one. So right now, FAR 19.104-1 says for contracts above the micro purchase threshold, the contracting officer must set the contract aside for small business if there is a reasonable expectation of obtaining offers from two or more responsible small business concerns and that are competitive in terms of fair market prices, quality, and delivery. So the rule of two survives. It's now above the micro purchase threshold. There's nothing in there about the simplified acquisition threshold. They basically smushed together the prior rule of twos, one of which was between the micro purchase and the simplified acquisition threshold, and another above the simplified acquisition threshold. Now it's just one rule that applies above the micro purchase threshold. So that's the big headline. The rule of two survives. We have seen members of Congress introduce bills to keep the rule of two in the FAR. We'll see what happens to those bills. Those bills would have expanded the rule of two to include not just contracts, but orders. You notice when I read that, it said contracts. That expansion does not happen through the FAR. It would have to happen by statute at this point because the FAR has been changed to address that particular scenario. But there's not as much urgency, it would seem like, to pass those bills because the regulatory rule of two is present in this FAR overhaul in the 19.104. Overall, the newly revised FAR is reorganized. Regrettably, they have changed all the numbering. So it used to be very easy to remember which part of the FAR covered 8A because it used to just be 19.8. That was 8A, and I can always say, 19.8, and that sounds so smart. All you have to think of, because that's the number of the program. They've changed it. They've been doing this thing where they try to organize the parts of the FAR based on the procurement life cycle. So they've done that here with Part 19. 19.1 is pre-solicitation, 19.2 is evaluation award, 19.3 is post-award. So they don't even get to 8. It ends at 3. So we don't have that numbering anymore. You don't have separate sections for hub zone and women owned. That all goes into 19.1, different subsections of 19.1. So the Part 19 has been reorganized. One of the big policy changes is in the 8A program. The 8A program is, I don't know about the statistics, but probably primarily it's a sole source program. Agencies can issue sole source contracts to 8A firms and even individual 8A firms below what they call the competitive threshold, which is $4.5 million or $7 million for manufacturer. That's going up to 5.5. But this FAR now says that contracting officers must first try conducting the acquisition as a competitive 8A order under government-wide contracts before using a sole source 8A award. So that is a really big change. That's in 19.108-7. And that shifts the 8A program from being mostly a sole source program to being one where, under this FAR provision, competition is preferred. That's one big change to the 8A program. The other big change to the 8A program is in the requirement for a release from the 8A program. Previous to this change, if an agency wanted to award a follow-on to an 8A contract, the agency would need to get SBA's release. That recognizes that SBA, under the statute, is the prime contractor on the contract. And so you'd have to come to some sort of understanding with SBA to take that requirement out of the program. That's called the release requirement. The releases would go to the SBA associate administrator. That's not the case under the FAR overhaul. I'm not exactly sure how the FAR did this because it's still in SBA's regulations. It's still in all the partnership agreements, but it now says that an agency can move the contract to one of the other socioeconomic programs, Service Able Vet, Hub Zone, Women-Owned Small Business, without receiving a release from SBA. Says here, 19.108-11, it says, once a requirement has been accepted by SBA into the 8A program, any follow-on requirements must remain in the 8A program unless there's a mandatory source, SBA agrees to release the requirement from the 8A program for a follow-on non-8A procurement, or the follow-on will be set aside under the Hub Zone, SDVOSB, or WOSB programs. That part is new. That was not in there before. Before, SBA had to actually grant a release from the 8A program. And that was one of the elements that SBA would look at in granting that release, but that release was not automatic or even presumed under the previous policy. And again, I'm not exactly sure how that happened because the release requirements are in SBA's regulations. They're also in the SBA partnership agreements with agencies. Another important change is in particular wording that encourage agencies to use the socioeconomic programs ahead of a small business set-aside. This actually come up in litigation recently before the Government Accountability Office. There's language in Part 19, meaning the old FAR, the current FAR, that says that agencies, let me just make sure this is the actual wording, agencies must consider, this is in, or shall, maybe it's shall consider. Let's see if we can find this. It said that, I'm going to find the exact language, but it said that agencies have to look at the socioeconomic programs. They must consider or shall consider the socioeconomic programs prior to issuing a small business set aside. Guessing it's in 19.5. So let me find that. Here it is. Well, this is an order. But it says, for an order, when setting aside an order above the simplified acquisition threshold, the contracting officer shall first consider setting aside the order for small business socioeconomic contracting programs, i.e. 8A, hub zone, service-able veteran, small business, and women-owned small business before considering a small business set-aside. So I think it's shall first consider is the words that I'm looking for. And then it also says that in 19.203, it says, this is the prior FAR, the non-overhauled FAR, it says, for acquisitions of supplies or services that have an anticipated dollar value exceeding the simplified acquisition threshold, the contracting officer shall first consider an acquisition for the small business socioeconomic contracting programs, i.e. 8A, Hub Zone, SDVOSB, or WOSB programs, before considering a small business set-aside. So that essentially means you need to look at these 4 socioeconomic categories, the ones that I repeat all the time, 8A, Hub Zone, Service-Able Vet, and Women-Owned, before you use a small business set-aside. There was a case just about 2 weeks ago before GAO that I think it was a service-able veteran-owned firm that came to GAO and said that an agency had violated the requirement to use a service-able vet set-aside and instead used a small business set-aside. This was not a VA case. And GAO said, well, there's not a requirement to use the set aside. What the requirement is to consider it. And that doesn't mean that you have to set it aside. It's just you consider it. And the agency says it considered it. So you lose, protester. All that's required is a consideration, not the actual set aside. Well, even though it says consider, which does not seem like very powerful language, the FAR has eliminated that shall first consider language from this overhaul. So I was just talking before about how the rule of 2 survives. There's no longer, let me just make sure, first consider. Nope, that does not come up. There's no longer a requirement for agencies to consider the socioeconomic programs before using a small business set aside. Instead, it says the requirements of paragraph A, which is the rule of 2, this 19.104-1, the requirements of, let's just say it, the rule of 2, do not preclude the contracting officer from awarding a contract to a small business under the Hub Zone program, SDVOSB program, WOSB program, or 8A program. So you've shifted from shall first consider to now do not preclude. That's very different language. Definitely no way that you're going to be able to protest on the do not preclude language. You know, it's questionable whether the shall first consider was very powerful on its own, but the agencies are no longer going to be expected to look at the socioeconomic programs before they use a small business set aside. Okay, let me see what else we have here. The definition section consolidates several definitions. We've seen that. Now it's much shorter. You're going from 19.0 to 19.3 in the overhaul. And previously it went all the way to 19.16. So you've gotten the 19.15. I saw it's about 300 lines shorter. So some of this stuff is probably going in a companion guide rather than staying in the FAR. It's not that much shorter, but it's not like 50% shorter. It's a bit shorter. But some of that collapsing is, first of all, you collapse the 2 rules of 2 into 1 rule of 2. And then also you change these definitions. On PCR coordination, which is the new 19.102, those have been collapsed into one section instead of being in multiple sections of 19. One nice thing about that is it refers by reference to SBA's rules, which is, when I was at SBA, we always liked it when the FAR incorporated SBA's rules by reference because it's a lot easier to just change stuff in one place in SBA's rules rather than having to do it in both the FAR and in SBA's rules. So let me just make sure I see where that is. This is in 19.102 in the overhaul about PCRs, and it says, now in 19.102D, it says the duties assigned by SBA to its PCR are set forth at 13 CFR 125.2b and include, but are not limited to, reviewing proposed acquisitions to recommend the set-aside or sole source award to a small business of selected acquisitions. There are requirements there in that 19.102 for contracting officers to provide proposed acquisition packages to PCRs 30 days before the solicitation is issued, in cases where it might be consolidated or bundled, or where it's of a dollar value where it's unlikely for the small business to be able to compete for that. That does have the reference to 125.2b, which is always nice to have the reference to SBA's rules. I saw another place where there was a reference as well. I think it was in size protests. Yeah, NAICS code appeals. NAICS code appeals are filed in accordance with 13 CFR 121.1103. So that's nice to have that reference there. And there's a lot in here for the programs that refer back to 13 CFR. So always good to have these references to 13 CFR. Uh, One area that has been taken out from the FAR, and what they're saying is it may be in a compliance guide in the future. I haven't actually checked to see. I think it says FAR companion guide coming soon at this point. So I'm not sure that it's on the live compliance guide yet, or companion guide, excuse me. One area there is the responsibilities of the OSDBUs, Office of Small Disadvantaged Business Utilization. I was interested in this because FAR Part 7 took out an element, responsibility of OSDBUs. FAR Part 7 used to say that small business specialists had to be notified for any requirement that was over the substantial bundling threshold, and they took that out. So small business specialists were not required to be informed of or included on the acquisition plan for those requirements. And I thought maybe it would come back in Part 19, but it's not in there. So what they've said is this is going to be in a companion guide of what OSDBUs and Office of Small Business Programs and Small Business Specialists are expected to do. And that's unfortunate. It's the responsibilities of the OSDBUs are statutory. Let's see. It just says, there's a sentence, in certain instances, coordinating with SBA, the director of the OSDBU, or the director of OSBP is required. So in certain instances, it does say contracting officers must consider the recommendations of the agency director of the OSDBU, or for the Department of Defense, the director of OSBP, as to whether a particular contract should be set aside. And that's about it. There's really not that much more. And it used to be a long list of responsibilities for the OSDBUs in this. That list still is still in the statute, so it's not like the law has gone away. It's just the list is no longer in the FAR. And presumably that may show up in the companion guide. Still have the appeals processes for contracting officers rejecting a PCR recommendation. That's good to get in there. Let me just make sure I see where this is. This is in subsection F of 102. And that still has a 3-tiered appeal process. So the first level is the PCR and the contracting officer. If they don't agree, then it can go up to the head of contracting activity. And on SBA side, the PCR. And if they don't agree, then it can go up to the secretary of the agency and the administrator of the SBA, the agency head and the administrator of SBA. So that PCR review process survives. That's very important. I was wondering if they're going to change the date for multiple NAICS. Probably very few people are aware that there's been this long saga of trying to force the FAR, maybe it's not the FAR, but maybe SAM.gov or whomever is in charge, to allow for multiple NAICS codes on a contract. SBA had that in their rules ages ago, in 2016. And the idea is, you have these huge contracts And you shouldn't just have one size standard because there's multiple different types of work that's going on under several different industries. Uh, so you should be able to have different NAICS codes for those and several different industries. But it sounds like STAM.gov doesn't allow for that, or contract writing systems don't allow for that. So the FAR has continuously pushed out the deadline for that multiple NAICS code requirement. I know at one point it was 2025, maybe before that it was 2023. Now it's pushed out to 2028. And that makes it into this new FAR. It does say that when there is multiple NAICS codes past 2028, whenever that happens, the orders under those multiple NAICS codes would be set aside with the specific size standard for that NAICS code. Um, Commercial plans. Let me take a look at that. Commercial plans are still in the FAR. Maybe there's some thought. Commercial plans are subcontracting plans on commercial contracts. And there was some talk about whether commercial plans would be in this, because commercial plans are not statutory. They're actually not even regulatory. They're not in SBA's rules. I think it was something created by a Clinton era executive action and then made its way into the FAR. And commercial plans are still in this. Commercial plans, so commercial subcontracting plans are 19.206-1C. They're still stated as the preferred type of subcontracting plans for contractors furnishing commercial products and commercial services. There's going to have to be some close reading of the subcontracting plan sections because those get very detailed with prime contractors needing to have subcontracting plans for small businesses. Oh, I wonder if they put in the new 30-day requirement for small business invoice payment. There was a statute 2 years ago that changed the requirements for paying a small business subcontractor's invoice from 90 days after the invoice due date to 30 days after the invoice due date. And that hadn't been changed in the FAR or in SBA's regulations. But I don't see that in here. So I have to check more closely to see what happens with those. I don't have any hits for invoice on this. So I wonder if that's not covered in here at all, which would be surprising. Or maybe it's in a clause. I'm just looking at Part 19. I'll look closely at the clauses to see if there's something in there. All right, and let me look at 19.303. And that is 8A program contracts. And that does reflect that when a contractor exits the 8A program, agencies can continue to get credit. However, an 8A contractor represents as other than small, or where ownership control of the 8A contractor has changed, the agency may not credit any subsequent orders awarded to the contractor toward its small disadvantage or small business goals. So I think that's a change because SBA a couple years ago, it said that if a contractor gets to the end of a long-term contract, one that's over 5 years, and it's no longer in the 8A program, if that was an 8A contract, then the agency is not able to exercise the next option on the contract. I think that was actually, I know it's in SBA's regulations, and I'm fairly certain that made it into the FAR. But I do not see it in the overhaul. So that would be a change if it's not in the overhaul. So it seems like there's a lot of changes on the 8A side. have to look back and see where that was in the FAR. I remember. Oh, here it is. So this is the existing FAR 19.812D. It says for 8A contracts exceeding 5 years, including options, the contracting officer shall verify in DSBS or SAM that the concern is an SBA certified 8A participant no more than 120 days prior to the end of the 5th year of the contract. If the concern is not an SBA certified 8A participant, the contracting officer shall not exercise the option. So that was in the existing FAR. And I was trying to see if that's in the new FAR. Oh, it is. Okay, it is. I just missed it the first time. It's 19.303-1D. That's pretty much the same language for 8A contract exceeding 5 years, including options. The contracting officer must verify. If the concern is not an SBA certified 8A participant, the contracting officer must not exercise the option. Okay, so the big headlines are the rule of two survives, at least for small business, and the FAR has collapsed the rule of two, so it's not two separate rules. Instead, it's one rule above the micro purchase threshold. Changes to the 8A program. The first change is that the FAR tells agencies to look at competitive 8A awards under task order contracts, even below the competitive threshold. Previously, most awards under 4.5, soon growing to 5.5, would be sole source 8A awards. And now the FAR is telling agencies, no, use competitive task orders for those awards rather than using sole source. And then the second big change in the 8A program is not requiring 8A release when an agency is going to use a different set-aside program. It's the service-able vet, women-owned, or hub-zone programs. On the shall first consider, the FAR has taken out the shall first consider language, which told agencies to consider using the socioeconomic programs before using small business set-aside. So you might expect that agencies would be more open to just going straight to small business set-aside rather than the socioeconomic programs. And I'm going to move some of the language with PCRs and OSDBUs, particularly on the OSDBUs, moved a lot of that language to the FAR companion guide, which I'll check at some point. Also, the clauses are another area that we'll have to take a close look at, particularly on the subcontracting portion, to see what's changed there. But my initial reaction is, a lot better than it could have been, especially with the talk about taking about rule of two or taking out some of the PCR reviews. Most of that still sticks around. The procedures for filing protests with SBA stick around. If you're on the 8A side, you might be a little surprised by some of the changes that took place there. But the program's still there. Some people are even speculating they might even take out the 8A program, women-owned program altogether. Those programs are still there. They're different places. The numbering has changed. But the program survived. The rule of two survives. Potentially less sole source for 8A, potentially more small business set-asides rather than socioeconomic set-asides. And then there are a lot of details to unpack in the coming days as we look more closely at this. So stay tuned to govconintelligence.com, and I'll be covering all of this over the next few days on the newsletter. Thanks very much. Have a great weekend, everybody.